So, onwards with the combat phase. After a phasing faction has completed their movement or commands, then the combat phase follows, which consists of the player activating possible battles. A battle is an area in which there are units of two or more enemy factions. So, if the phasing player is the Japanese and has conducted this kind of movement, these are all possible battles. And in each one of them, they have to activate their units and reveal them to their opponents. And it's up to them whether they will activate the battle itself or not. Exception: they have got to activate any battles in which they conducted aggression this turn. So, for example, if this carrier did this type of movement, it has to activate this battle and fight against this British infantry. But if this ground unit has been here since a previous season, then it's up to the Japanese whether to activate this battle or not. At this point, I have to remind that the first time you move into this area to try and gain control of it, this is termed aggression. But if during your movement you just brought some reinforcement during a subsequent season, this is not aggression. You're just engaging, but you're not aggressing. So you're not obliged to activate this battle. So it's time to talk about how we fight a battle. And there are two types of battles: sea battles or naval battles, and land battles. Land battles are fought in land areas, of course, as well as straits and islands and islets and island bases. And sea battles or naval battles are fought in sea areas only. The difference is that in land areas we fight only one combat round, and you will see shortly what I mean by that. And in sea areas, we fought the battle to the conclusion until only one faction remains. So each round consists of all the revealed units of all the factions included taking a combat action. A combat action is either firing a hit or retreating. And in order to determine the order of the combat actions, we use again this combat chart. So we consult this chart and determine the order of the combat action. Fortresses are always the ones to take a combat action first, which of course means firing a hit because they can't retreat. And then it is air forces, carriers, submarines, fleets, and so on, in this order. Between like units, the defenders' units take a combat action first. Now, the defender is the non-phasing player, and the attacker is the phasing player, the one whose turn it currently is. So the attacker is not necessarily the aggressor, and the defender is not necessarily the owner of an area. Let's break this down again. It is the turn of the Japanese, and they conduct this type of movement to invade Philippines. The Americans have been here the longest, and they are the owners. The Japanese are the aggressors, and in this battle, they will also be the attackers, because it is their turn. But if none of these units is eliminated, and they all survive, then in the US player's turn, of course this one will be hidden to indicate that these are the owners of the area still. If it is the turn of the Americans, and they activate this battle, which again they don't necessarily have to do, but if for any reason they decide to do so, then they are the attackers despite being the owners, and the Japanese will be the defenders despite being the aggressors in this area, which plays its part during the combat action order, because like units, like air forces against air forces, the defenders ones take a combat action first. So if the Japanese are the defenders in this case, their units will take a combat action before the enemy's ground units, because these marines and the militia, which you see in parentheses, have the same combat action order as other infantry units. Now, a combat action again can be either retreating or firing a hit. And the retreat move is actually a reaction move by moving out of the battle area, following the usual border rules. So again, depending on the border, the number of ground units that can use it is limited. So for example, if the battle is fought in Nanking, only one unit can cross this border to retreat, and maybe this unit can use this border to retreat elsewhere, for example. So retreating means abandoning the battle area and moving into an adjacent land area, which has to be friendly and undisputed. You can't retreat into enemy territory. Another restriction is that you cannot retreat the way the enemy came. So for example, if the Japanese sea invaded here, you cannot retreat by moving out to the sea. Of course, you have to retreat elsewhere. And if you are the invader, it is the opposite rule. You have attacked through here, you have engaged through here, so you have to go back the way you engaged from, which would be East China Sea in our case, if you retreat as the Japanese. And a last restriction is that you cannot retreat into sea with a ground unit unless you've got another unit there to escort them. So in this case, it is considered like this unit can escort the Japanese ground unit and they can retreat the way they came back into the sea. Now let's highlight a very tricky difference among disengage and retreat. You might recall that when disengaging, you may disengage into sea areas and then possibly continue your move and even land at another land area, but you cannot re-engage. So in this case, you were able to disengage into the adjacent sea. This is not the case with retreat. So for example, if suppose this is the case and the British tank has engaged Hanoi, in this case the Japanese player cannot retreat into Gulf of Tonkin, which is an adjacent sea area, unless they've got a unit of any type there to kind of escort them. The reason makes a lot of sense. Disengage is an organized process. In this case, the army is using his built-in boats or barges capability and then can continue his movement. However, in the case of retreat, this is at a disorganized manner in the presence of the enemy, so you cannot just take your leave and go. You need some friendly fleet or something to escort you. So in mechanical terms, this means that in this case the British player has to be very careful, because if, for example, the Japanese is playing right after the capitalist faction, they can retreat here and possibly use their right next move to occupy Saigon, take control of it, and render this poor guy out of supply. And now it's time to talk about a special feature of the ANS units, Air Forces, Navals, and submarines, which is rebasing. This is a kind of more complicated way of retreating, and it consists of the following. Instead of just retreating into an adjacent land area, you can use your movement allowance to move into a friendly, undisputed land area. So for example, this Air Force, and at this point I have to remind you that it cannot retreat back into sea because it is an aeroplane. So rebasing means instead of retreating into an adjacent land or sea area, if you follow the above mentioned rules, you can use your full movement allowance, which is 2 in this case, in order to move to an undisputed friendly land area, which in this case could be Okinawa or Kyushu, for example. You can use your movement allowance of 2 to rebase back here. This would be an equivalent to a retreat for this ANS unit. This cannot be conducted by ground units, of course. Now, the other type of combat action is firing. When it is your turn to fire, you roll a die and you consult this chart again. You roll a number of dice equal to your combat value. So for example, if it is a 2 combat value infantry unit firing, you are firing 2 dice, and you have to specify which class of units you are targeting. There's a separate die roll range depending on your target class, be it air, naval, ground, or submarine units. For example, an infantry unit can attack air forces with a die roll range of 1, or naval units, again with a die roll range of 1, or ground units with a die roll range of 3. So if the enemy is a ground unit, like in this case, this 2 combat value infantry will roll 2 dice against the infantry, and if it rolls 3 or lower, it is a hit, otherwise it is a miss. So if we roll 2 dice, and these are the results, one of the die rolls is a hit and the other one is a miss. And of course you cannot target submarines because these are lighter shaded, so you have no die roll range for them. When rolling the dice and after determining the number of hits, the other player, your opponent, has to allocate the hits, and it always has to be a unit with the highest combat value among the participants. So for example, if we've got a tank, a marine, and a Chinese militia, then you will notice that these two are of 2 combat value and this tank is of 1 combat value. So if the Japanese player scored 2 hits, the first one would have to be either the marine or the militia because of their 2 combat value, and after reducing 1, the second hit could only go to this unit because of its higher combat value. You cannot split your dice roll among different classes. Each unit has to fire separately and indicate the target class. So for example, this infantry cannot split its 2 die rolls among infantry and naval units, for example. But if you've got another ground unit, one can target ground and the other one can target naval units. Now, we have mentioned that in sea, ground units become convoys. Convoys have no combat action. They cannot either fire or retreat during a combat round. And in order to target them, you have to target them separately using your naval dice rolls. So for example, if you are a fleet, you have to target convoys specifically, and you use your die roll range of 3 or less, and its die roll of 3 or less is a hit against the convoys. Another specific detail is that convoys, as well as carriers, take double damage when being hit. So each 1 hit allocated deals a damage of 2 combat value. So if this guy is a convoy and takes a hit, he is immediately sunk and eliminated. Okay, so again, when fighting a land battle, you only conduct a full combat round, and any surviving units live to fight another day. You conclude the land battle. At the end of a land battle, of course, if there's only one side remaining, this side gains control of an area, and any active player's ANS units may optionally rebase. So for example, if these units are surviving this battle, they can, at the owning player's discretion, move to rebase, like use their movement allowance of 3 to move to an area within their range. Optional rebase is different than rebase during a battle, because in this case, you just follow the movement rules. You move them using your normal movement allowance of 3. But when retreating from a battle, like for example, in this case, when using rebase to retreat from a battle, you have to first return the way you came, and then you can use the rest of your movement allowance. So once more, if you are attacking and you want to retreat, you have to first move back and then determine where you want to continue your movement. But after concluding the combat round, you can move wherever you want within your range in order to attempt the optional rebase. Another result when concluding a land battle is that ANS units without ground support must retreat or rebase. So what does ground support mean? This is another aspect of the game that regards the ANS units. ANS units, which again is Air Forces, Naval and submarine units, cannot hold disputed ground without ground units supporting them. So if they try to invade this area against, say, an American unit, at the end of the combat round, they have to retreat or rebase because they have no ground support. And in this case, if they invade without a ground unit supporting them, this is termed a raid, which is not intending to claim control over the land, just to bombard the enemy and then leave. Raids are always the first battles to be resolved. And there's also a special restriction regarding retreat, in which you cannot retreat into an area which held a battle, but you can retreat into an area that held a raid. So, for example, if the Japanese player raided Mindanao with all these units and also conducted movement to attack Visayas, this battle, which is a raid, must be resolved first. And whatever happens in this battle, the Japanese have to retreat or rebase with all these units. And because this was a raid, in the subsequent Battle of Visayas, the US Marine can retreat into Mindanao. But if this was a full-scale battle, which would include ground support, then the Americans would not be able to retreat into Mindanao, because this featured a battle. So at the end of a land battle, any ANS units that remained without ground support, possibly because their ground support was eliminated, must retreat or retreat by rebasing, which means again they have to follow the retreat rules and first go back the way they came and then possibly continue their movement. Another impact of the lack of ground support is the following. If during a supply check the ground supporting unit dies of attrition, then the ANS units remaining in the disputed area without ground support against enemy ground unit must also rebase or retreat. And in this case, they should follow the normal movement rules and go wherever they can by using their normal range. In this case, they have to rebase to a friendly, undisputed land area. If they cannot do so, they are eliminated, of course, regardless their remaining combat value. Now it's the perfect time to talk about the impact of certain technologies in battle. As we mentioned earlier, you can reveal your technologies at any time, and this includes the start of a battle. So, for example, this one technology is very useful in battle because it indicates that your fleets first fire against enemy fleets, of course. It does not override the normal combat sequence, but when talking about fleets of both players, yours will fire first, regardless whether you are the defender or the attacker. If the other player also has got the naval radar technology, they cancel each other out, and we again determine the sequence by the defender firing first. So some technologies give you first fire advantages. Other kind of technologies give you some other advantages, like Air Force's Move 3, for example. And there's a whole lot of technologies. For example, I would like to mention the incendiaries technology. So this one means you can separately target your opponent's industry for a die roll of 1. So raids into unoccupied territory are normally prohibited. You cannot use your ANS units to attack an unoccupied enemy area. This is an exception. You can use it to target your enemy faction's main capital and target the enemy's industry for a die roll range of 1. So if you roll 4 dice for this unit's combat value of 4, any 1 results that you achieve will drop their industry level by 1. Again, you are not allowed to raid an enemy territory when it is unoccupied, because ANS units are not meant to claim control of an area. Only ground units can do so. So you can conquer this island, for example, only by using an infantry unit or a SNLF unit, for example. After gaining control of it, however, you can maintain the control by sending other kinds of units, for example. So this submarine is sufficient to maintain control of the area. So for example, in this case, Fujian is home territory for the Chinese, and the Japanese cannot raid this one by using their submarine because it is unoccupied. But they can use the infantry to take control of it, and in a subsequent season, by moving their infantry out, they may bring in an ANS unit to maintain control of it while they use their infantry elsewhere. So until this submarine is attacked, they maintain control. But if a ground unit attacks here and the submarine has to retreat or rebase because of lack of ground support, they lose control of it, of course. So naval combat is a special kind of combat. First of all, it is fought to a conclusion, so there is not only one round here, it will be fought until only one side remains. Also, some units act differently in naval combat. So for example, when there is an air force fighting, it will only fight for one round, and then because of fuel shortages, it will have to rebase. Another difference is that units that come from different areas are grouped as different battle groups. So if the Japanese come from Carolines and Palau separately, this one is a battle group and this one is another battle group. But if they all come from the same area, stacked and moving together, this is one battle group. In each combat round, you will reveal only one battle group. So for example, if these are two different battle groups, the Japanese may only reveal one of their battle groups to fight the first round, and of course retreat or rebase at the end. And then in the subsequent combat round, this submarine will fight the surviving American units. And if there is a third battle group coming from a different direction, it will be revealed during the third combat round, for example. Of course, if the Air Force was not revealed because it was another battle group and thus it didn't join the fight, then it does not have to rebase because it did not participate in the battle practically. As we mentioned, convoys have no combat route, so they cannot retreat or fire, and of course they cannot engage or disengage, thus they cannot move into a disputed sea area and a sea area occupied by enemy units and thus start a battle. This is not allowed. Another special feature of sea battle is that at the end of a combat round, a submarine may escape. So if this one survived the combat round, instead of fighting a subsequent combat round, it may be flipped down, and in this case it is considered escaped, so it will not participate in the subsequent combat rounds, and it will not affect control of the sea in any way, so enemy units can move above this area. But it has another implication related to blockade, which we are going to talk about later. Carrier units also work differently in sea, in that they can use their special shoot and scoot movement, which means instead of targeting an enemy naval unit normally with their die roll of naval 2, they can use their shoot and scoot ability to attack and immediately retreat. And as you will notice, they fire before the fleets, so the carrier will take its combat action by hitting and running, and the fleet will not have a chance to fire back. So let's focus in this battle again. The Americans are fighting the Japanese, and the American carrier gets to do a combat action first. So they use their combat value of 4 to roll 4 dice, and they choose before rolling the dice to target enemy navy with shoot and scoot. So they roll 4 dice and they only deal a hit with the results of 1. So any one result is a hit. You disregard the normal 2 die roll range and you immediately retreat or rebase before the enemy gets a chance to fire back. Also, we've got some special features for the Japanese player. Japanese have got a special naval advantage in Conquest and Consequence, which is, first of all, their fleet's first fire. This is called precision optics, and it means they detect the enemies first because of their advanced technologies, and they fire first against the enemy's fleets. Of course, this can be cancelled by the naval radar technology. So if the Americans have a naval radar, they fire first, of course. But if both Japanese and the Americans have got naval radar, then the rule reverts back to normal, which means the defender fires first. Another Japanese advantage is that they hit enemy navy at a die roll range of 4 instead of the usual 3. This is called long lance. And the last ability of the Japanese is that they can use their air forces and carriers to do the so-called kamikaze attack, which means instead of firing their normal dice against the enemy navy, they sacrifice the unit so it is eliminated after the combat action, and it fires at naval 4, which means any result of 4 or less is a hit against the enemy naval units. So, some more things about combat before moving on. As we have mentioned, the moment a ground unit invades, it is considered a sea invading unit. And in this combat round, it is not able to attack. However, it can absorb the hits or the damage taken. So, for example, this 1 combat value Japanese infantry cannot attack in the same round it sea invaded, but it can absorb the 1 hit of this tank. However, the Japanese SNLF Marines or the American Marines can attack at the same combat round they are invading. And also I should mention that there is a technology which allows all units to attack at the same round, which is this technology, the AMF tracks. So the side that has achieved this technology can fire with their sea invading units. Okay, so one last thing I would like to mention is the possibility of a 3-way fight. In this case, we've got capitalist units and socialist units stacked here in Nanking, and the Japanese are entering this field. So all these units have survived all previous battles, and the Japanese are the third side to invade this territory. So if they are not at war with the Soviets or the Americans in this case, they have to declare war upon them. And now they get to choose who they fight, so which side will be absorbing the hits, and only the defending side will fire back against them. In case they manage to eliminate some of the defending sides, let's say the Soviets for example, then the side that has been there the longest becomes the new owner of this area, regardless whether they were before the Soviets or after them. When talking about arrival units at sea, you can pass through them or stay at the same area as them because you are not at war against their faction yet. So it is up to you whether you want to declare war and attack this unit when moving and engaging, or you can just ignore them and coexist peacefully until your faction is at war with the enemy unit's faction. And there is also the chance of a 3-way fight at sea, because let's suppose that in this case the US and the Soviets are at peace with each other, but the Japanese are at war against both the Soviet Union and the USA. So in this case, they must kind of fight a 3-way battle against both the units. But in each combat round, you can choose which side you attack, and therefore this side can fire back at you. But of course, this has to last until all defending sides are eliminated, or the defender is eliminated or retreats, or both defending sides have retreated. So, to war. Let's talk about declaring war upon an enemy faction. You have to declare war when you engage them in land, for example, because as we have noted, it is not mandatory that you declare war upon them when meeting them at sea. But if you want to meet them in land, then you have to declare war. So if the Japanese move here or here, they have to declare war upon the Americans. Okay, this is an unfortunate example. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, let's suppose they enter a territory with US units. Or the other case is if they are entering a US territory or Soviet territory, they have to declare war to the owning faction. So even if Manila is unoccupied by US units, if the Japanese enter this US territory, they have to declare war upon the US. So, apart from aggressing an unoccupied enemy territory or aggressing enemy units, there is one more case in which you have to declare war. This case is when you end your move into the so-called territorial seas. For example, you violate this territorial seas by finishing your move here. So you have to declare war on the Americans. Or let's suppose you have already declared war on the Americans, but you also have to declare war on the British Empire if you finish your move here. Now, what does this mean? You can cross this sea and possibly end your move elsewhere, but if you finish your move here, you have to declare war. In this case, onto both the US and the British Empire. So, seas and oceans adjacent to home territory of a naval power, which is US and British Empire and Japan, are called territorial seas, and you are kind of violating the international law if you needlessly end your move here. So let's remind that British home territory is at Canada and Australia. So moving a Japanese naval unit here also constitutes a violation of territorial seas and requires a declaration of war onto the British Empire. An exception to that is the sea areas adjacent to Soviet territory. Soviet Union is no naval power, so whether the Soviets move a fleet here or the Japanese move a fleet here, they are freely allowed to do so. This does not require a declaration of war. Also, let us make clear that when you declare war, you have to conduct an aggression, even if, for example, you aggress a naval unit. Same as with violation of neutrality, where you have to aggress the neutral you violate. Now, the effects of a war declaration is that, first of all, you have to flip this resource marker to the other side to indicate that now you have to take the resources into account when determining your production level. Also, you flip this marker towards declaration of war on Soviets, for example, because now it means one victory point less, as we're gonna see later. And the other side will be removing this marker. So from peace with Japan, it is totally removed from the game for the rest of the game, because now, because the Japanese have declared war, their industry cost drops by one level, which means from 8 to 6 for the Soviet player, for example. Otherwise, from now on, there is no further penalty for invading enemy territory. Another result of the war declaration is that during the first combat round, the declaring side can first fire. So, for example, in this case, let's suppose this was a US tank, for example. So, in this case, the Japanese tank is attacking the US tank, and because Japanese have declared war this round, they will be firing first with their tank, despite being the attackers, which lasts only for the current round. Now, there's a special effect for the Japanese war declaration, which applies only in Conquest and Consequence. And this is that before war is in effect, the Japanese may move as many of their air forces and carriers as they wish through rival occupied seas. So these carriers may move through these waters and bypass enemy units as if it was a peaceful move, because otherwise the rule is that the declaration of war must be made before moving any of your units this round. Japanese sneak move is an exception. You can move carriers and aeroplanes peacefully, and then at the end of your movement you can fire at the enemy units as a surprise attack without the defender having a chance to fire back at you. So the Japanese conduct a kind of Pearl Harbor by bombarding enemy units, be it US or Soviet, with their air forces and carriers. The enemies do not have a chance to fire back. And after that, a normal combat round follows, with the attackers having again the surprise because of their declaration of war, so they have the first fire there as well. This last one effect can of course be negated by enemy held technologies like naval radar, which allows the fleet to first fire. Also, when Japan declares war on the Soviets, in the following year, they receive these units, which is the Russian reserves sent from the rest of Russia into Siberia to withhold the invasion, which is two 1 combat value infantry units, one combat value tank, and one combat value air force. These normally arrive in the New Year phase of 1945, but if the Japanese attack the Soviets, they arrive earlier, and they can be placed either in Tashkent or Novosibirsk at the Soviet player's discretion. Also, if the Japanese player attacks the US player, they get their naval construction accelerated. So usually the Americans receive a 1 combat value carrier, fleet, and sub in the year of 1942, in the New Year phase, and then the same units at 2 combat value in 1943, and the same units at 3 combat value in 1944. But if the Japanese declare war on the Americans, these units arrive in the following year's New Year phase and can be further built up during production, so the Americans can build this one up from 1 to 2, for example, and these ones in the subsequent years, of course. And also, if it is a declaration of war upon the Americans by either the Japanese or the Soviet player, the Americans will also be receiving a 1 combat value infantry and a 1 combat value air force in each of the 3 following New Years. Okay, so once more, after factions are at war, they stop receiving peace dividends at the start of the new year, and also factions at war must check for supply and blockade. So this one guy is pretty fine if his faction is at peace with Japan, but if they are at war with Japan, these units here all block him from tracing a supply line, so he will suffer attrition and possibly be eliminated at the end of the season. Also, it's time to talk about blockades. Blockade check happens at the end of the summer season. After finishing with movement, combat, and supply, we check blockade. Blockade means checking for each faction's population and resources whether they reach their main capital, which is the production center. So, for example, let's suppose we are checking the American faction. Their production center is Los Angeles. We must now check whether their resources and population can trace a trade route to Los Angeles. So, for example, Seattle, of course, has got a value of 1 population and 1 resource, and it reaches Los Angeles, of course. But, for example, let's check the nationalist China's resources. Nanking has got a value of 2 population and 2 resources. This trade route or line has to be traced through either friendly territory or open seas or neutral nations. So they are at peace with Canton, for example, and while they cannot trace supply for their units through here, they can, however, trace the trade route through Canton, for example. So the line can go through here and then here, for example, all the way to Los Angeles. They can also cross friendly or neutral straits and islets. So, for example, they may use this Kyushu islet base if they are at peace with Japan, but not otherwise. So basically treat straits and islets as open seas for all game purposes if you are at peace with their owning faction or neutral nation. So, for example, if these sea areas are occupied by the Japanese, then these resources and the population are in trouble because they have trouble in tracing a trade route towards Los Angeles. So let's suppose, for the sake of this example, that all these areas are under Japanese control and the nationalist China or the US cannot trace a trade route for these resources and population towards Los Angeles. So these ones are considered blockaded. So we place these markers, and in this case neither Wuhan nor Suzhou nor Nanking can provide their population and the resources to USA. So we go back to the production track and mark that during the blockade phase by denoting which resources and the population is usable or not. So in this case, because we lost some 2 resources from Nanking and 4 population for the nationalist China home territory, this will be the unblocked resources and the population level for the US player. So during the New Year's production, if after fall and winter all these resources and population remain blockaded, in this case the US production level will be this one, not this one. So the US player has got a deadline of fixing that issue during the fall and possibly winter, but most likely fall of the current year. So there is one more restriction regarding blockade, which is the trade route path has to consist of 1 land segment and 1 sea segment at max, which means you have to either use a segment that consists of land areas and straits at first and then switch to sea, which consists of sea areas and islets or straits, for example. You cannot switch back to land again or vice versa. For example, in this case, let's suppose the Americans are trying to trace a trade route for this population and the resources from China. Nationalist China territory is theirs, but they're trying to trace a path for all of these population and resources of theirs until Los Angeles. So in this case, because of the presence of these Japanese ANS units in the neighboring seas, these areas have to first trace to land and then switch to sea. And they have to reach Los Angeles. But because of the presence of these Japanese ANS units, they will have to trace to land in Acapulco, for example, and then follow a land path towards Los Angeles. This is not allowed, and these resources and pop from China are blockaded because by using 1 land segment and 1 sea segment, they have not been able to reach Los Angeles. Any further than that is disallowed. And one last thing to note is that, as we noted previously, submarines may escape at the end of the combat round if they survived. So, for example, if this Japanese submarine escaped the combat and is underwaters, it might not affect the control of the area or the movement of the enemy units, but it still blockades the Americans. So, for example, this one will block the trade route for Nanking towards Los Angeles. So, this one would still be considered blockaded. Now it's time to talk about China, which is what makes Conquest and the Consequence so much more complex than Triumph and Tragedy. So China consists of all these areas, denoted by these border lines. Manchuria is a Japanese colony, but it is also included in China. North of these lines there's Mongolia and the Soviet Union, and south of this line is Indochina. Also there is this region of Hainan. So in China there are the Chinese units, which is these ones. So these are nationalist China units, and these are red Chinese units or communist Chinese units. And all the rest of units potentially entering China, like Soviets, Japanese, British or American units, are termed foreign units in China. So foreign units in China cannot enter freely, exception the Japanese can freely enter China by violating either Chinese neutrals or either of the two proxy powers. And as for the rest of the factions, the Soviets, British and Americans can only enter China with their own foreign units if they are at war with Japan. So for example, let's suppose the Soviets declare war in Japan and invade Manchuria. This is valid. Manchuria is a part of China and you declare war and you can enter it. Now, one important exception for foreign units in China regards their supply limitations. Let's suppose the situation is like this. The Japanese have invaded into Shanxi. This unit will be out of supply. The reason is foreign units in China, in order to trace supply through Chinese land territory, they have to not only have control of these intervening land areas, but also their own units there. So if a Japanese unit is here, it can help this guy trace supply. If it is unoccupied, then the supply tracing cannot pass through here. So it is very difficult for foreign factions like the Japanese or Americans or Soviets to invade deep into China because they have to mine their supply, which cannot be traced if the intervening land area is unoccupied. Okay, now let's talk about the Chinese units. First of all, no Chinese units of any type can leave China. So this guy, for example, cannot exit China into Indochina. Or even this Air Force cannot even move here to the adjacent sea for any reason. Now then, Chinese units are divided into two categories. These two are provincial units, the militias and the forts. The rest of the units that can possibly be built are the so-called regular Chinese units, which is tanks, infantry, and air forces. So you've got your base units, which is some forts to defend your Chinese territories, and the militias, which is the weakest unit you can get, because if you look at the combat charts, they can only fire at the ground in the same priority as other infantry units and after tanks possibly fire, and they only inflict damage on a 1 or 2 roll. However, their advantage is that they never require supply. They can live off the ground, so you don't have to worry about supply for your militias. And then there is the regular units. Investing some of your production to build some regular units can be a way to acquire some more powerful units in China without necessarily having to bring your foreign units inside. So, as we have mentioned, The Americans use their proxy production, which is their nationalist China production, to build units. However, this production can only be invested in provincial units, never in regulars. Regulars always have to be built through normal production, either US production or USSR production. These units always require supply. So, for example, during setup, you are given some cadre steps to use. You can use these cadre steps to set up some regulars, for example in Nanking if you are the capitalists, or in Xi'an if you are the Soviets. However, if for example you build this guy in order to have a strong infantry, this guy is out of supply because Xi'an is not a supply source and he will have to trace supply to Novosibirsk from the get-go, even if the Soviets are not at war with anyone. This Chinese regular will have to trace supply and he will possibly be facing some serious problems because he first has to secure a supply line, possibly through Kansu and the Xinjiang and on to Novosibirsk, or alternatively from Inner Mongolia and through Mongolia. However, upon claiming more and more territory for your proxy power, so for example, if the Americans expand their foothold or the Soviets expand their foothold into China, all these newly acquired territories are considered home territories, which means you can use your production or proxy production if you are the Americans in order to build new cadres there. You're not restricted into your initial holdings. And one more important rule before we move on is that these Chinese units, regular or provincials, never benefit from technologies. So even if somebody gets jets or heavy bombers, this does not affect the Chinese regular air forces, for example. Now let's talk about the partisans, which is a Soviet-only thing. The Soviets start the game with one partisan set up in Xi'an, and they can potentially place more partisans in the game in China. Partisans are placed when the Soviets expend diplomacy cards for Chinese provinces. For example, by using this card, the Soviets can place a partisan into one of the provinces of their choice, be it Canton or Changsha, and then they expand the card. So instead of normally placing influence, they can place partisans. So for example, maybe they do not have 3 Canton cards to place influence and take over Canton diplomatically, so they find it more valuable to place some partisan in Canton and later use him to take over Canton militarily. Now, these guys do not affect control and they do not trigger any kind of combat until they are militarized into militia. As long as they are here, they can be suppressed by enemy units, as we're going to see later. But in order to actually exert some control, they have to be militarized. When militarizing a partisan, for its militarization, you expend one command from your card in order to convert your partisan either to a new militia in his location or to upgrade or build up your pre-existing militia. So for example, if this guy was here, you can remove the partisan and militarize this guy by promoting him. Now, newly militarized militias cannot move at the same turn. But if they are militarized in enemy territory or neutral territory, this constitutes an aggression normally, as if the militia had come from another province. So for example, if Canton starts neutral and this guy is militarized into a single-step partisan, then Canton will be triggered as an armed minor and it will spawn a fort that will attack the militia. This means that you can do this militarization even on emergency command unless you're triggering aggression. Also, the Soviets, during their movement phase, may attempt to roll dice equal to the command points they want to spend in order to create new partisan. the number of dice they are eligible to roll is equal to the number of restive provinces, which means the Chinese provinces which have partisans upon them. So in this case, it would be 4 dice. So this would be 4 provinces. So the Soviets would be eligible to expend up to 4 points of their command in order to roll dice. And for each result of 6, they can create a partisan. And the newly created partisan can be placed in any restive province, even multiple partisans in one province. In their combat phase, enemies can try to suppress the partisans before being militarized. So, for example, the Japanese player in his combat phase can attempt to suppress this one partisan without the need for any extra commands. Of course, if they have played a valid season card. And in order to suppress this one, so eliminate him, they use their ground die roll ranges. So they can activate as many units as they want. So for example, this one combat value infantry and or this 3 combat value air force, and they target the partisan. And if they hit him like an infantry unit, they eliminate him. Forts cannot be used to suppress partisans. But for every die roll result of 6, a new partisan is born. And note that they have to always roll all the dice for the units they activated, and the 6 die roll results are applied last. So, for example, if they activated 1 infantry unit and a 3 combat value air force unit, they have to roll all these 6 dice, and even if 3 results are a hit and this partisan is eliminated, if one of the dice is a 6, the new partisan will be born. Lastly, we've got to mention the Soviet ability of playing the red insurgents. So if during the government phase the Soviet player plays 2 copies of the same Chinese province in their secret vault, they can later reveal these 2 in order to surprise their opponents and create a 2 combat value militia in Inner Mongolia. So if they reveal these 2 cards, a new 2 combat value militia will be created here in Inner Mongolia, and this can lead to surprise attacks. Also, the Soviets have got the ability of placing partisans in otherwise nationalist China home territory or Manchurian territory. There are no cards for Manchuria or nationalist China territory or Xi'an, for example. But if you use this purple option, you can place partisans in Wuhan or Jehol, for example, which would otherwise be impossible. And it goes without saying that you cannot use some wild cards in order to place partisans. And now it's time to talk about the Soviet technologies. These ones are Soviet only, which means the Soviet can either place this card for its factory value or for its other effects. But instead, they can also play it for the Soviet technology or red tech. And in this case, it is propaganda, which means the recruit success would be on 5 or 6 instead of only 6. So you're more likely to spawn more partisans. And this one, guerrilla warfare, would mean that the partisans can ambush, so they are turned from their partisan side into the guerrilla side. And anytime an enemy is trying to suppress them, they first roll a die with a 1 die roll range, and they can attack ground units. So a ground attack on a level of 1. So first they roll the die, and if they roll a 1, they reduce an infantry unit or ground unit by 1 step before receiving any damage. And the third technology for the Soviets would be land reform. And this one is a very good technology for early game, and as the Soviet player, I advise you to go for these red technologies as early as possible. And this would mean that the cost for increasing the loyalty level or CPC by 1 level, which normally is 6, as you can see here, If you achieve this technology, the land reform one, it is flipped to this side and it is reduced to 4. So by spending 4 factories from now on, you can raise the CPC level by 1. And this does not apply to the KMT level for the nationalist Chinese. This always stays at 5. So instead of spending factories of 7 for the American player, or 4 if you are declared war upon in order to raise your industry level, you can spend a factory value of 5 or more in order to raise your KMT level. So, time to talk about the victory conditions of the game. There are practically 3 ways to achieve victory. One is to control 2 enemy capitals at once. So, for example, if the Japanese have taken control of Nanking and Novosibirsk, they are the winners, whether they have held control of all their own capitals and sub-capitals or not. So, even if they have lost Osaka, for example, or even Tokyo, they will be the winners. Also, I have to remind that the main capital is the production center as well. So, while during blockades, all resources and population have to be traced to the main capital, if the enemy is controlling your main capital, you have no production at all, nor proxy production. Another way to win would be the atomic victory. So there are some technologies that refer to the atomic research. You can play them as normal, either revealed or hidden in your secret vault. You have to play 2 copies of the same technology, but one thing is that you have to achieve them in order and only once per year. So there are 4 levels of atomic research, and you can only achieve 1 level during your government phase. It's a year, and you are responsible for maintaining the order of achievements. So, for example, in 1 year, you have to achieve Atomic Research 1 by playing 2 copies of the same card, either revealed or hidden in your secret vault. And then during the next subsequent years, you have to achieve Research 2, Research 3, and Research 4. Upon the time you decide to reveal all these steps of atomic research, if during a friendly movement you can legally reach the enemy's main capital with your air forces, so for example, if an American air force can reach Tokyo or a Japanese air force can reach Novosibirsk, for example, then you automatically win by threatening your opponents with an atomic bomb. The third way would be to achieve economic victory. The economic victory check is done during the New Year's phase. So, during the New Year's phase, you win if you have achieved a score of 25 victory points or more. For this check, you count your current production level as normally, which in this case would be 4 for the Soviets because of their industry. And you also count your progress in the Chinese Civil War, which is only valid for the Soviets and the Americans, the ones who are fighting the Chinese Civil War. In this case, it would only be the master level for the Soviets. Normally, you only count the master value or the city's value for the nationalists, and you don't have to count CPC or the Kuomintang for the nationalists. But if the Soviets attempt an intrusion in China or the Americans attempt an intrusion in China, then we use this marker, which means China intrusion. And in this case, you count the lesser of these two. So you have to take CPC into account as well. So at the start of the game, the Soviets are only concerned with increasing their master level by gaining control of cities and towns in China for the Reds. But if they commit an intrusion, which means moving Soviet units into Chinese territory, then we flip this marker from the avoids China side to the China intrusion side. And as you will notice, Manchuria is an exception, which means the Soviets can enter Manchuria by declaring war to the Japanese, for example, and possibly trying to conquer Mukden without any penalty. Their China Civil War status will not be harmed. But if they move anywhere in China but Manchuria, then this equals to a China intrusion. And in this case, you don't count the master value for victory, you count the lesser one among the master value and the CPC level. Same for the US if they enter Chinese territory with American units, which again can only be done if they are at war with Japan. Also, in order to count towards victory, you also count the levels of atomic research, and each level contributes one victory point. You also count the value of all accumulated peace dividends, and lastly, the player who controls more enemy bases, and by bases I mean these hexagonal territories, gains one victory point. This is regardless of the number of enemy bases you control, whether it is 1 or 2 or 3. If the Americans control more Japanese bases than the Japanese control American bases, then the American player will gain 1 victory point. Also, you gain 2 victory points for every enemy capital or subcapital you are controlling, which of course in our case equals to 2 victory points for controlling an enemy capital, because if there was a second one it would be automatic military victory. And you lose 1 victory point for its declaration of war you have made during the course of the game. Lastly, if the year of 1945 ends without a winner, we conduct a kind of final scoring, which is called Asian hegemony, and the player with the most victory points wins, except in this case we disregard the blockades and we conduct the production phase as if there was no blockades. So this was the game for you guys. I hope the explanation was clear enough. Next one, I will try to break down the strategy for its faction as well. But until then, if you have any questions about the rules or strategies or comments about the game, feel free to share it with me in the comment section. Looking forward to meet you in the strategy section and later on into the playthrough.